Then I'd like to go ahead and call the Falls Church City School Board electronic meeting for April 21st, 2022 order. And I'd begin with a note that a reminder to everyone that on April 6th, the City Council adopted the emergency ordinance TO 20-12, which allows the school board to meet electronically in order to address continuity of operations associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Our electronic meetings will still be open to the public. They're streaming live on YouTube here, and there will be an opportunity for the public to submit comments to be read at the meeting, and all of our meeting notices will continue to be posted on our website with the agendas available on board docs. So with that, that preamble, Ms. Goodell, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, Mr. Anderson.
Here.
Ms. Dimick.
Here.
Ms. Downs.
Here.
Ms. Litton.
Here.
Mr. Reitinger.
Here.
Ms. Russell.
Here.
And Mr. Webb.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Will you rise and join me for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. I would seek a motion regarding tonight's agenda.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Reitinger. Thank you, Mr. Webb, for the second. Ms. Goodell, will you call the vocal roll, please? I believe you're muted, but
Sorry, Mr. Anderson.
yes.
Ms. Dimick.
Yes.
Ms. Downs.
Yes.
Ms. Litton.
Yes.
Mr. Reitinger.
Yes.
Ms. Russell.
Yes.
And Mr. Webb.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So moving on now to public comment and requests, I'll just say, while the state of emergency remains in effect due to COVID-19, written statements may be submitted to the clerk for dissemination to the board, and they will be read into the record. And in accordance with School Board Bylaw 2.30, the time for each speaker is limited to 3 minutes. Those who have statements they'd like to have be read into the record, please send them to School Board Clerk Marty Goodell at goodellm@fccps.org. And Ms. Goodell, have we received any public comments?
No, we have no public comments this evening.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
With that, then we'll go ahead now and move to our work session. First item, the budget update, item 3.01, and Dr. Noonan.
I thought I'd have this down by now. Good evening. Thank you, Chair Anderson and Vice Chair Russell and board. It's really great to see all of you as usual here this evening. Looking forward to the days when we can be back together for sure. This evening, we would like to host a work session about the budget, following up on the meeting that we had last week. And as we do that, we've begun to think about the budget, as we indicated last week, sort of in two different ways. And the first is the 2020 budget, which is this current fiscal year, the 2021 budget, which would be next year. And so tonight, and I don't know, John, if it's on the screen or not, but our, Kristen, is it up, or John? There we go. Let me walk through the agenda, if I can, in that slide presentation first, just to kind of show you what the structure of the meeting is. And then I'm going to ask Kristen to begin with a monthly budget monitoring report. So let me ask that the PowerPoint agenda be projected first. Just to kind of walk you through. Thank you. So a couple of, as that's coming up, a couple of things that I wanted to make sure that I reiterated to the board, and sort of our approach to this budget, considering the very unique and unprecedented circumstances of what's happening with the economy within the city and certainly within the state, is that we are committed to, as best possible and whenever possible, not to create a budget that ends up in any kind of reduction in force action. We really are proud of the employees that we have, and we'd like to keep them. And also as we're approaching the 2020 and 2021 year end and next year's budget, we wanted to also put into context the partnership that we have with the general government and with the city council. So this year, as or tonight, as we walk through the agenda, again, we'll begin with the current year, and Kristen will share with you the monthly budget monitoring report. And then I will dive into recommendations for addressing the budget shortfall that we are experiencing this year in 2020. And then we'll move on to the 2021 advertised budget. And there again, we'll share the revenue projections, the expenditure adjustments that we believe we can make that will help us meet the projected shortfall. And then the memo to the city council, which you all have had an opportunity to see the first draft of, with a little bit of feedback from a couple of people. And Tricia, as we walk through this, Tricia has some of those, and I know Mr. Anderson will raise the opportunity to share. And then the last thing in this presentation is I do want to go through the budget calendar one more time. But the main thing I want to make sure that I frame this as is, we really took the approach of trying to find a way that we would not have any reduction in force, and we could maintain the partnership that we have with the city council going forward. And as I say that, one of the things that I would just call our attention to, just as a reminder, is in 2019, there was a revenue surplus, and they did pass a budget adjustment and amendment not too long ago that provided us with some extra dollars into a capital account. So we've done our part, they've done their part, and we continue to sort of work together cohesively to take the good with the bad and the bad with the good. So with that, I'm going to ask Kristen if she wouldn't mind walking through the budget monitoring report. And from there, I'll kick back in with the presentation.
So thank you, Dr. Noonan. This evening, I'm going to present the monthly monitoring report for March, which is month 9. First, I'd like to thank Michelle Kopic, who I know is watching on YouTube, for all of the great work she did pulling this monitoring report together and completing all of the projections. Posted for this tonight, we also have the February report posted. The February report was done prior to the shutdown for COVID. So it doesn't include any of the updates in terms of the potential revenue impacts, and the March report has newer expenditures. So I'm going to start tonight with March. So on page 1, we have a summary chart of the revenue and expenditures by major categories. And just for anyone who might be watching online, the chart shows the following information. First is the revised budget, that's the current budget. The next column is the actual year to date. It's either the revenue that we've received or the expenditures that we've incurred, and those are through March 30th. Then we have any encumbrances or purchases. Those are really anything that we've ordered. We may not yet have received it, or we may have received it and already been invoiced. And then the next column that we have is the sum of available budget. So what that is it's the revenue that we've budgeted and not yet received, or the expenditure budget that remains available after we've taken into account the expenditures to date and the encumbrances. Overall, from a big picture perspective, when comparing our current position with prior years, our revenue and compensation expenditures are tracking really consistently with prior years through the end of March. And due to the timing of the impact of COVID-19, we're going to see those expenditure and revenue impacts in the upcoming months. So after I go through where we are currently, I'll go through our projections following that and incorporate those impacts. So first I want to start with other revenue. So other revenue through March totals $429,000. And when we look at where that revenue is coming from, $176,000 comes from school bus stop arm violation fines. And then $219,000 is coming from tuition charged to families. And those are for students who attend Jesse Thackeray Preschool. So those are Falls Church residents. Or it could be people who live outside Falls Church City and have students enrolled at George Mason High School. So when we think about the impacts of COVID, when we get to the projection section, I'll talk about how both the stop arm camera and the tuition could be impacted in that last quarter. The next line is use of fund balance. Historically, whatever fund balance we use post at the end of the fiscal year. The next category is state aid, and state aid is tracking as we would have expected through March. When we look at the caboose budget from the governor, the caboose budget has us approximately $100,000 lower than we originally had budgeted. but that's being offset by $154,000 in state technology funding that we received at the beginning of this fiscal year that was really anticipated in the prior fiscal year. The next category, federal revenue. When we look at that revenue received to date, excuse me, it's primarily funding for IDEA or special education and Title II. So when we look at that revenue, federal revenue is typically reimbursed for grant expenditures that have already occurred. So when we look at that revenue, we've received about 70% of our Title II funding. And then for our IDEA or special education funding, we have so far received reimbursement for our first quarter expenditures, which total $115,000. The majority of our federal revenue overall is for special education, and that funds teaching positions in our schools. So we expect that to be fully expended by the end of the fiscal year. The last thing is the transfer from the general government. That too historically usually posts in the last month of the fiscal year. And that's another category that we expect to be impacted by COVID that I'll talk about in the projection section. When we look at the expenditure, the bottom half of this chart, salaries are tracking consistently with last year. And at this point, we have 9 months of our 12-month salaried employees, and we have 7 months of teacher salaries. And that's because we pay our teachers over 12 months. So the pay that teachers are going to receive in July and August is really part of this year's budget. So that's going to post back to this fiscal year. Overall, when we look at the percentage of salaries that are yet available to be spent, we're at 37.5%, and that's exactly the same as we were at in fiscal 19 at this exact same point at the end of March. When we look at benefits expenditures, we're also tracking consistently with last year. We have 34.4% available, and that's just ever so slightly less than the 34.6% that we had available last year. So just as a reminder, the only benefit that we pay over a different period other than 12 months is the Virginia retirement system. That's for a retirement and life insurance benefits. And they require that we pay those over the time that a teacher is teaching. So we pay those over 10 months instead of 12 months. So then the remaining categories on this chart are other expenditures or logistics. Those accounts are currently trending lower than last year. And that's because last year we had additional expenditures for Mount Daniel that occurred early in the year. When we think of our expenditures for other categories like logistics, they don't track nearly as consistently as salaries and benefits. So we'll continue to closely monitor those throughout the fiscal year. And I'll talk more about that in the projection section. When we look at encumbrances or those orders that have been placed but not yet received, we currently have 1.45 million in encumbrances, and that's only slightly higher than the 1.4 million we had in encumbrances last year at this time. So again, very, very consistently. So if we look at this report online, and I'm going to try to talk and screen. So when we look at page 2, this goes over and it compares our current fiscal year with the 2 previous fiscal years. So this is where you can see both dollar-wise and percentage how we're spending. So I just went over that in the expenditure section. And then in each monthly monitoring report, we also provide a bar or a graphic to go with that text. So the next items in this report I want to talk about are the projections for next year. So when we look at this chart, it's exactly the same as the summary chart that we went over on page 1. And we've added the last 3 columns on the right. Our end of year forecast, how much revenue do we expect to receive, or how many expenditures do we expect to have? What that variance is as compared to our budget. And then lastly, what is that percentage variance? So I'm going to first talk about revenue and then I'll move to expenditures. All of the items on this chart, Michelle has updated with the projected impact of COVID-19. So the first category that we look at, other revenue, I had talked about that revenue is largely comprised of stop arm camera violations and tuition. So because in this last quarter, so from mid-March, April, May, and June, we don't have buses running, we don't expect to receive additional stop arm camera revenue once we get the revenue from the mid portion of March. So we won't see any additional revenue. And this is a category where we were trending above the budget. Then also for the last quarter, we're not charging tuition to residents of the city whose children attend Jessie Thackeray Preschool. So we'll also have a loss of that revenue. The second item on this category is use of fund balance. In this chart, we're projecting that